Hi, Silent Warriors. Today, I bring you a story about the power of quiet strength. The story of a man whose silence roared louder than any battle cry. Let's start the story. Part 1. Can silence roar? Have you ever wondered why the strongest warriors often say the least? Why their eyes seem to hold entire worlds, yet their lips barely utter a single word? In a world that's noisy with empty boasts and hollow promises, silence is not a void. It's a fortress. It is not weakness, but unshakable strength, a quiet force that shields the soul and sharpens the mind like the finest blade. Today, we unravel the legend of a man whose silence thundered louder than the fiercest battle cry. A silence that changed kingdoms, shattered hearts, and rewrote the fate of all who crossed his path. In the ancient realm of Aloria, where power was measured not only by the sword one wielded, but by the weight of one's words, there lived a boy named Kale, born not to royalty or riches, but to the relentless struggle of common folk. Kale's life began in the humble fields and worn-down villages that dotted the vast landscape. Raised among farmers and wanderers, he quickly learned the harsh reality that words, often thought harmless, could be sharper and deadlier than any blade. A careless phrase could spark war, betray trust, and lead to ruin faster than a fist ever could. So Kale chose a path few dare tread, silence. Not because he lacked a voice, but because he understood the power of listening deeply, of observing quietly, and striking only when the moment was perfect. In a world that shouts, silence becomes a revolution. This was no idle proverb to Kale. It was a way of life, a shield, and a sword all at once. Kale's childhood was shattered one brutal night that still haunted the very marrow of his bones. Raiders, merciless and ruthless, descended upon his village like a pack of wolves, hungry for destruction. Flames licked the night sky, screams tore through the darkness, and the sweet scent of home turned to choking smoke. Houses burned, memories were lost, and innocence was ripped apart. Amid this nightmare, Kale's father, the village's lone warrior, stood unyielding, a pillar of calm in the chaos. A man of few words but fierce spirit, he wielded his sword with precision and honor, defending his people without a single cry or boast. His stance was steady, his resolve unbreakable, even as he fell beneath the merciless onslaught, blood staining the earth that had once nurtured them. That night, as the dying embers flickered against the blackened sky, a new understanding was forged in Kale's heart. True power was not born in the roar of war or the clamor of battle. It was found in presence, the quiet, unyielding will that speaks louder than any cry. The loudest roar often comes from the quietest heart. From that moment, Kale vowed to honor his father's legacy, not by shouting into the storm, but by becoming the calm eye within it. He embraced silence as a sacred ally, training his mind to observe, his spirit to endure, and his soul to strike when the time was right. But silence alone was not enough. In a world ruled by sword and spoken decree, Kale knew he must become more than a silent observer. He needed to be a force, a shadow moving unseen, a whisper turning tides, a warrior whose silence could topple empires. Yet, this journey was fraught with trials. Kale's silence made him an enigma. To some, he was a mystery cloaked in shadows. To others, a ghost haunting their fears. Villagers whispered tales, some filled with awe, others with suspicion, calling him strange, aloof, even cursed. The young men mocked his quiet nature, mistaking his silence for weakness or cowardice. But Kale bore their scorn as a seasoned warrior bears wounds, silently and with unbreakable resolve. You cannot understand the strength of silence until you have heard the scream of defeat. Every day, Kale honed his craft, not only training his body to be swift and strong, but sharpening his mind and spirit to endure the harshest storms. He learned that silence was not merely the absence of noise. It was the presence of strategy, the space where true wisdom breathes. In the stillness, Kale found clarity. In the quiet, he heard the world's secrets. With every breath, he listened, not only to the sounds of the world around him, but to the whispers of his own soul, guiding him toward a destiny far greater than any sword could carve. He discovered that silence holds many faces. It is patience when the storm rages, strength when words fail, and power when action demands subtlety. It is the calm before the thunder, the pause before the strike, the space where legends are born. Silence isn't empty. It's full of answers. Kale's resolve grew with each passing day, but so did the dangers surrounding him. The kingdoms of Eloria were a powder keg of greed and ambition, their rulers eager to silence any threat that dared to rise. Whispers of rebellion stirred, and Kale, the silent warrior, became both beacon and shadow. His presence was felt before it was seen, his silence spoken of in fearful tones by those who recognized his true power. The path ahead was uncertain and perilous, but Kale's heart burned with a fire no silence could smother. For he knew that sometimes the quietest roar could shake the very foundations of the world. As the stars wheeled overhead and the wind carried forgotten songs through the ruins of his childhood village, Kale stood tall, silent, steady, unstoppable. And the world would soon learn. Silence can roar louder than any sword. Part 2. When the world talks too loud. Years passed, yet Kale remained wrapped in silence. A man carved by hardship, forged by fire, and tempered with the unyielding strength of quiet resolve. The boy who once witnessed his village burn had grown into a formidable warrior, strong, fierce, and unshakable. But his voice was still unheard. To those around him, this silence was baffling. Villagers and soldiers alike whispered and scoffed behind his back, labeling him the mute knight, the speechless fool. Yet no mockery, no taunt could diminish the overwhelming presence he carried into every battle. Kale was more than just a warrior. He was an unrelenting force of nature. His sword did not simply strike, it danced. Every movement was poetry in motion, fluid yet deadly, precise yet graceful. His shield rose and fell with rhythmic purpose, deflecting blows and striking fear into the hearts of enemies who never heard a single word from him, yet felt the weight of his silence like a crushing storm. His quietness was more terrifying than any war cry. It was a voice that shouted death, a presence that commanded respect, a stillness that promised ruin. But beneath this outward calm raged a far greater battle, the chaos inside his own mind. The noise of the world outside, the endless expectations, the betrayals, the losses, howled inside him like a tempest that refused to be silenced. Cale wanted to scream. He wanted to ask questions, demand answers, and rage against the cruel fate that had stolen his childhood and his father. Yet, every time the urge to break his vow of silence rose, he saw his father's calm, steadfast face, unmoved in the firestorm. And so, Cale stayed silent, finding strength not in sound but in stillness. Sometimes the loudest storms rage inside the quietest souls. In the land of Eloria, noise was currency. Bards filled taverns with endless tales and songs. Politicians flooded courts with promises and deceptions, and every street corner echoed with debates and arguments. Words were weapons, and volume often equaled power. Yet in this relentless clamor, Cale was an anomaly, a silent force that drew both awe and suspicion. People leaned closer, desperate to unravel the mystery behind the man who refused to speak. What did he think? What did he believe? No one could say. His unpredictability made him dangerous. For in a world where every word was weighed, the silent were often the hardest to read. Legends are not born from what is known, but from the unknown. Cale's silence became its own language, rich with meaning. It spoke of discipline and pain, of fierce conviction and hidden depths. Those who tried to understand him found themselves drawn in, caught in the invisible web of his presence. His silence commanded respect, a quiet authority that echoed louder than any shouted order. But the world's noise was relentless and unforgiving. Whispers became rumors. Rumors turned to accusations. Some called Cale cursed, others whispered he was mad. His enemies used the mystery of his silence as a weapon, sowing fear and doubt wherever he went. But Cale did not waver. His battle was not with the voices of the world, but with the chaos inside. He trained harder, pushed farther. His body was a fortress, his mind a blade sharper than any sword. Yet, when night fell and the stars bore silent witness, Cale wrestled with the ghosts of his past, the screams of his burning village, the faces of lost friends, the burden of silence heavy on his soul. Still, he remained unmoved on the surface, a rock amid raging seas. Silence is not absence. It is presence. It is the pause where strength is born. Cale had learned that silence was both shield and sword. It was a sacred space where his spirit gathered energy, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He knew that sometimes speaking was a weakness, and silence was the greatest form of defiance. To speak was to reveal, but to be silent was to wield power over what others could not grasp. So Cale moved through the world like a shadow, quiet, watchful, deadly. His silence whispered secrets to those who listened closely. Kingdoms rose and fell around him, but Cale's quiet strength remained constant, a reminder that true power often hides where eyes fail to see. The louder the world screamed, the more his silence roared. Yet beneath that calm exterior lay a soul scarred but unbroken, ready to shatter silence when the time came. For Cale, silence was not a void. It was his battle cry, his oath, his strength. Part 3. The Battle of Echoes. The winds of fate carried whispers of an impending storm. the Battle of Echoes, a war destined to carve the future of Eloria into the annals of history. This was no ordinary clash of swords. It was a battle where silence and sound would collide, where myths would be tested and legends would be forged in blood and fire. The enemy was a ruthless coalition, tyrants bound by greed and cruelty, who believed that Kale was nothing more than a quiet myth, a ghost story told to scare children into obedience. They scoffed at his silence, mistaking it for weakness, blind to the storm brewing beneath that calm exterior. But myths, when challenged, do not crumble. They awaken. The morning of the battle dawned heavy with tension. The vast field where countless souls would soon dance between life and death stretched endlessly, bathed in the pale light of dawn. The ground itself seemed to hold its breath. Kale stood among his comrades, not with a roar but with a steady gaze, a silent promise in his eyes. His sword rested lightly in his hand, not a weapon of destruction, but a brush with which he would paint the destiny of his people. The battlefield was his canvas, and every move Kale made was a stroke of purpose and precision. He did not rally his soldiers with fiery speeches, nor did he chant war cries that echoed through the hills. No, his voice was silent, but his actions spoke volumes. With every step, Kale wove a tapestry of courage and strategy. Each life he shielded was a verse of hope. Every enemy he struck down was a note in a symphony of defiance. His movements were poetry, graceful, deadly, and unwavering. His silence was not emptiness, but a powerful language that inspired, commanded, and terrified. As the battle raged, the clash of steel and cries of warriors filled the air. Yet, through the chaos, Kale's presence was unmistakable, a silent force moving with the inevitability of fate. Soldiers who fought beside him felt an unspoken strength, a beacon in the darkest moments. Enemies who crossed his path found themselves facing not just a man, but an idea, a silence so loud it shattered their resolve. Then came the moment that would echo through generations, the final confrontation. The enemy leader, a towering figure draped in arrogance and malice, stepped forward. He sneered, his voice cutting through the din like a whip. "Say something, warrior," he jeered. "Defend your people with your words. Show us your voice, or admit you are nothing but a shadow." Kale's response was not in words. He raised his blade, a simple, powerful gesture that spoke louder than any speech. The steel gleamed in the sunlight, a silent declaration of defiance and strength. A raised sword says more than 1,000 trembling tongues. That quote, etched forever in the chronicles of Eloria, captured the essence of Kale's power. The silence he wielded was a roar that shook armies and toppled tyrants. With a sudden burst of movement, Kale surged forward, his blade slicing through the air with relentless precision. The enemy leader faltered, overwhelmed by the storm of silence that was Kale's wrath. The battle tipped in favor of the defenders as Kale's silent command rallied his comrades into a final, unstoppable charge. The ground trembled beneath the clash of wills. Blood spilled and dreams were forged anew. The Battle of Echoes was not just a fight. It was a symphony of courage, sacrifice, and silent strength. And when the dust settled, The silence that had defined Kale's journey became the anthem of a free Eloria. The enemy was vanquished, their tyrannical grip broken. The people's cheers rang out, not just for the victory, but for the warrior whose silence had spoken louder than any words ever could. That day, Kale proved that silence was not the absence of strength, but its purest expression. It was a language beyond speech, a force beyond comprehension. His silence roared with the power to change the course of history. Eloria was free, and the legend of the silent warrior grew, forever echoing through time, inspiring those who understood that sometimes the greatest battles are won not with noise, but with quiet determination and unbreakable will. Part 4. The pain behind the quiet. Victory had been won, the tyrants defeated, and Eloria free at last. Yet, for Kale, the war's end was not a moment of celebration, but the beginning of a far harder journey, a journey into the silence that hid the deepest wounds. The kingdom praised him, hailed him as a hero, a legend. Songs were sung, stories told, and monuments raised in his honor. Yet beneath the cheers and shining armor lay a truth few dared to see. The strength everyone admired was a fragile veneer, masking scars etched deep within his soul. Kale's silence had been mistaken for peace, but silence is not always calm. Sometimes it is a battlefield of its own. He had lost more than battles. Friends who had stood beside him were gone, fallen in fires of war or swallowed by the merciless tides of fate. The love he had dared to nurture, a fragile light in the darkness, had withered under the weight of endless conflict and grief. Each silent night was a prison of memories. Faces burned into his mind, regrets whispered but never voiced, and a loneliness that no applause could ever heal. Pain doesn't always shout. Sometimes it speaks in the quietest moments, in the stillness where the world forgets to listen. Healing doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers in quiet endurance. This truth became Kale's new companion as he returned to the kingdom, not as a warrior wielding a sword, but as a man seeking to rebuild what war had shattered. The silence that had once been his shield was now the space where healing began. Kale's vision for Eloria was different. He did not seek to strengthen armies or build towering forts. Instead, he built schools, places where knowledge and wisdom could flourish, where young minds would learn the power of listening before speaking. He planted gardens, sanctuaries of peace where the weary could find solace in nature's embrace. He taught the children the value of silence, not as absence, but as presence. In rare but powerful words, he told them, "Don't fear your silence. Fear the day it leaves you." This message spread quietly but steadily, touching hearts that had long been drowned out by noise and haste. People began to embrace reflection, discovering that true understanding requires more than words. It demands listening, patience, and empathy. And from understanding, true strength grows. Kale's silence evolved into a movement, a revolution of the mind and spirit. The kingdom, once driven by chaos and conflict, started to transform. Citizens learned to pause, to consider, to connect beyond the surface. The noise that once ruled the streets softened into thoughtful conversations. The restless clamor was replaced by a deliberate calm, a rhythm that nurtured growth rather than destruction. This was the legacy Kale wished to leave, not just freedom won by the sword, but a foundation built on the power of quiet strength. Yet, even as his vision blossomed, Kale's heart remained heavy. The ghosts of the past lingered in the shadows of his silence. Each day was a battle to carry the weight of loss without breaking, to turn pain into purpose without surrendering to despair. He knew that silence could be both a refuge and a prison. It could protect but also isolate. To heal, one must confront the silence, face the wounds hidden within, and find the courage to let the quiet speak. Kale's journey was far from over. The pain behind his quiet was a reminder that true strength lies not in the absence of suffering, but in the courage to endure it. As Eloria flourished under the new dawn, Kale stood quietly among the gardens he had planted, watching children play and learn. The kingdom had changed, and so had he. His silence was no longer just a shield. It was a voice that whispered to all who would listen. Strength is found not in the loudest shout, but in the quiet resilience of the soul. And in that whispered silence, a nation was born. Part 5. The Legacy of the Unspoken. Years flowed by like an endless river, carrying with it the stories of heroes and the whispers of legends. But among them all, none resonated more deeply. None echoed louder in the hearts of Eloria's people than the silent legacy of Kale, the warrior who vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared. There was no grand farewell, no speech that shook the kingdom to its core, no parade to celebrate his deeds. One day, he simply walked away, disappearing into the mists of the mountains, leaving behind a kingdom that both revered and misunderstood him. Statues were never raised in his honor. Songs were never penned by bards about his voice, because Kale's true voice was never spoken aloud. And yet, his story did not fade into the shadows of history. It grew, wild and unstoppable, like a fire kindled in the hearts of those who dared to listen. Every town whispered its own version of Kale's tale. In every village, parents told their children about the quiet warrior who spoke through his actions rather than his words. The man who taught them that strength is not measured by how loudly you shout, but by how deeply you feel. The man who showed that true power lies in stillness, in patience, and in kindness. Be like Kale, they urged. Be strong. Be still. Be kind. These words became a mantra, a quiet revolution that spread through the land. For Kale's silence had become more than a personal vow. It had become a movement that challenged the relentless noise of the world, the endless battle of voices vying to be heard, and the clamor that often drowned out truth. In the modern age, just as it was in Kale's time, the world was addicted to noise. Social arenas flooded with opinions, debates raged without end, and people shouted to be seen and heard, often losing themselves in the process. The warrior's silence posed a bold question to all who listened. In a world addicted to noise, can you embrace your inner silence? Can you be a warrior who doesn't always speak, but always feels, acts, and leads with purpose? This was Kale's true legacy, not the battles won with sword or shield, but the battles won within, the battles of quiet strength, unwavering resolve, and the courage to stand firm even when no one else understands. The warrior's silence is an absence. It's presence in its purest form. Those words became a beacon, a guiding light for generations. They reminded the people that sometimes the most profound messages are not shouted from rooftops, but whispered in moments of reflection. That sometimes the greatest leadership is not in commanding the crowd, but in listening to the quiet voice within. Cale's silence taught Eloria, and now teaches us, that strength comes not from noise, but from the calm center of being. It is the power of knowing when to speak and when to remain still. It is the wisdom to act with intention rather than reaction. It is the courage to be vulnerable and yet unbreakable. His disappearance only deepened the mystery surrounding him. Some say he wandered into the forgotten forests, seeking peace from the endless battles. Others believe he vanished to protect the kingdom from threats yet unseen, watching from the shadows, his silence guarding the land like an invisible shield. But perhaps the greatest part of Cale's legacy is this: the invitation to each of us to find our own silence, our own strength beyond words, to lead not with empty noise, but with purposeful action, to inspire not with grand speeches, but with quiet conviction, to live not for applause, but for meaning. Cale's story reminds us that sometimes the most powerful warriors are not the ones who roar the loudest, but the ones who stand silently, undaunted, unyielding, and unforgotten. And so, as you face your own battles, whether loud or quiet, remember the warrior who taught us all that silence can be a roar, that stillness can be a storm, and that the greatest legacies are those left unspoken but deeply felt. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.